I remember sitting there in that glass conference room at Harrington and Cole, staring at the projection screen while everyone politely applauded Oliver Grant for the promotion that had been quietly promised to me for years. And in that moment, something inside me didn't explode the way people imagine betrayal should. It collapsed, silently, like a building whose foundation had been eaten away long before the walls finally gave in. 11 years of late nights, missed holidays, client dinners, flights across the Atlantic, and quiet loyalty suddenly felt like evidence against me rather than proof of my value. And I could still hear Richard Collins saying my name earlier that morning with that practiced smile. "Daniel, we truly appreciate everything you've done." The same tone people use when they're about to replace a piece of furniture that no longer fits the room. What hurt most wasn't even the promotion itself. It was the detail I wasn't supposed to notice. The printed internal memo on the table that had Oliver's appointment dated 3 months earlier, meaning every reassuring conversation, every "just wait a little longer," every handshake had already been a performance, while the decision was quietly sealed behind closed doors. And I sat there nodding like a professional, shaking Oliver's hand, while everyone else believed I was simply disappointed, instead of realizing that something far worse had happened inside me. Because in that moment, I understood that the version of myself who believed loyalty mattered had just died, and the strange calm I felt afterward wasn't forgiveness or maturity. It was the quiet beginning of something colder, something patient, something that no one in that room was prepared to recognize yet. They thought they had taken my future, my position, maybe even my confidence, but what they had really done was remove the last reason I had to protect them. And as the applause faded and the meeting ended, I walked out of that room with a strange clarity settling over me, the kind that only appears after something irreplaceable is gone. And I realized that the most dangerous moment in a person's life isn't when they lose everything. It's when they finally stop caring about what happens next. Because that was the moment I stopped trying to survive.
Have you ever spent more than a decade building something, believing you were slowly earning your place, only to realize the decision about your future had already been made long before you were ever invited into the room? That question kept replaying in my head long after the meeting ended. I remember every detail of that morning with uncomfortable clarity. The glass walls of the conference room, the reflection of the city skyline behind the executives, the quiet hum of the projector, and the sound of applause that didn't belong to me. My name is Daniel Carter, and for 11 years I believed I was building a future inside Harrington and Cole. I wasn't just an employee there, at least that's what I thought. I was the person who fixed the problems no one else wanted, the one who stayed late when deals were falling apart, the one clients called directly when things went wrong. My supervisor, Richard Collins, used to say something during meetings. "Daniel's the reason half our clients stay loyal." Everyone would nod, everyone would smile, and every year during performance reviews, I heard the same quiet promise. Just a little more patience. I believed them. That was my first mistake. Because loyalty inside a corporate building like Harrington and Cole isn't a currency. It's a resource, something they quietly use until it runs out. The meeting where everything changed started like any other executive briefing. Polished table, printed reports, coffee cups placed carefully beside leather notebooks. I noticed Oliver Grant sitting closer to the executives than usual. That detail didn't seem strange at first. Oliver was someone I had trained personally 2 years earlier. Bright guy, ambitious, but inexperienced. When the CEO, Martin Harrington, began speaking, his tone sounded almost celebratory. "We're announcing a leadership change today." My stomach tightened slightly, not with fear, with expectation, because I had heard the same thing from Richard just 2 weeks earlier. "You've earned it, Daniel." Those were his exact words. "You've earned it." So when Martin continued speaking, I expected to hear my name. Instead, he said something else. "Please congratulate Oliver Grant, our new Director of Strategic Accounts." For a moment, the room blurred. Not dramatically, not the way movies show it. It was quieter than that, more controlled, like my brain was calmly refusing to process what had just happened. Then the applause started, hands clapping politely around the table. I noticed something strange about Oliver's expression. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't even nervous. He looked relieved. That detail stayed with me, because relief isn't the emotion someone feels when they hear unexpected news. It's the emotion someone feels when a secret is finally safe to reveal. I stood up. I smiled, and I shook his hand. "Congratulations," I told him. My voice sounded steady, professional, exactly the way they expected. But inside my chest, something had already fractured. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Because while everyone else celebrated, I noticed something sitting quietly near Oliver's folder. A printed memo. The heading read, "Internal Appointment Confirmation." I only saw it for a second, but one line stood out clearly. The approval date. 3 months earlier. 3 months. That meant every conversation since then had been a performance. Every reassuring smile, every promise, every "just wait a little longer." Richard had known, Martin had known, the entire executive team had known, and they still looked me in the eye every day pretending my future was still being decided. The applause faded eventually. People gathered their papers. The meeting ended. As we walked out, Richard placed a hand on my shoulder. "Daniel," he said quietly, "you understand how these decisions work." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. He smiled the way managers do when they believe they've successfully managed a problem. But something about that moment changed the way I saw the building around me. The polished floors, the glass offices, the quiet authority in Martin Harrington's voice. For 11 years, I thought I was climbing inside this company. But suddenly it looked different. Suddenly it looked like a stage, and everyone on it had been acting. Everyone except me. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office. The city lights flickered outside the windows, and for the first time in years, I opened the internal client database. Not because I was angry, because I was curious. Something about Oliver's calm reaction kept bothering me, that quiet relief, as if he had been waiting for the announcement. So I started looking deeper. Email threads, meeting records, project approvals. And then I found something that made the betrayal worse than I first believed. Oliver hadn't just been promoted, he had been introduced to several of my major clients months earlier, quietly, without telling me. My accounts, my relationships, my work, being transferred slowly behind my back. That's when the truth finally became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a last-minute decision. This wasn't politics. This was preparation. They hadn't just replaced me. They had been planning my replacement for months. And suddenly a question formed in my mind, a dangerous one. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because that night, staring at the client records glowing on my computer screen, I realized something that changed everything. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. And if they had spent months preparing to erase me, then maybe it was time I started preparing something too.
The strange thing about humiliation is that people assume it ends the moment the meeting is over. It doesn't. Sometimes it follows you quietly through the hallways, through the elevators, through the polite smiles people give you when they already know something you don't. The days after Oliver's promotion were strangely calm, too calm. Inside Harrington & Cole, everything returned to normal almost immediately, at least on the surface. Oliver moved into his new office on the 18th floor, a corner office, glass walls, the same office I had imagined walking into for years. I watched as assistants carried in new furniture and framed certificates. People stopped by to congratulate him. I walked past that office several times each day, not intentionally. Our department floor simply forced that path. Every time I passed, Oliver would glance up briefly from his desk. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he looked uncomfortable, but the expression I noticed most often was relief, as if the hardest part of something had already passed. That detail stayed with me, because relief doesn't come from success alone. Relief comes from escaping consequences. Meanwhile, the executive team behaved exactly as I expected, carefully polite. Richard Collins stopped by my office the next morning. "Daniel," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "I hope you know how much we value your work." I nodded calmly. "I understand." He studied my face for a moment. Maybe he expected anger, frustration, a resignation letter, but I gave him none of that. Just the same professional calm they had always seen. That calm made them comfortable, and comfortable people make mistakes. So I waited. Not emotionally, not impulsively. I simply observed. For the next 2 weeks, I watched the company the way an outsider might. I watched how Oliver handled meetings, how the executives treated him, how the clients reacted. That's when I noticed the first weakness. Oliver was confident in front of management, but nervous with clients. Very nervous. Because most of those relationships had never belonged to him. They belonged to me. During one conference call with Harrington and Cole's largest client, Fletcher Global Holdings, I noticed something subtle. Oliver stumbled when discussing their quarterly strategy. Not dramatically, just small hesitations, the kind only someone familiar with the account would notice. The client's CEO, Andrew Fletcher, asked a follow-up question. Oliver paused, longer than he should have. Then he gave a vague answer. The call ended politely, but I could hear the uncertainty in Andrew's voice. Later that afternoon, I received a direct email from him, not addressed to Oliver, addressed to me. The subject line was simple: quick question. Inside the email, Andrew wrote, "Daniel, I noticed Oliver handling the strategy call today. Are you still involved with our account?" I stared at the message for a long time. This was the moment where most people might react emotionally, explain the situation, reveal the betrayal. But that would have been too easy, too fast. Instead, I wrote a very careful response. "Oliver is leading the account now, but if you ever need clarification on previous strategy work, I'm always happy to help." Neutral, professional, nothing more. Andrew replied 20 minutes later, "Appreciate that, Daniel. I might take you up on it." That was it. A tiny crack. But cracks are how structures fail. Over the next few weeks, similar things began happening. Clients occasionally copied me in emails. Sometimes they asked questions Oliver couldn't answer easily. And every time, I responded politely, never stepping on Oliver's authority, never making him look incompetent, just quietly demonstrating something the executives had underestimated: experience, memory, trust. Then something interesting happened during an internal strategy meeting. Oliver presented a proposal for expanding Fletcher Global's contract. The numbers looked impressive: projected revenue, growth potential. Martin Harrington seemed pleased. But while Oliver spoke, I noticed something in the financial projections. A mistake. Not a small one, a dangerous one. The proposal assumed a market condition that had already changed 2 weeks earlier. If the deal moved forward based on those numbers, the company could lose millions. I realized something then. Oliver didn't know, and the executives didn't know either. But I did. For a moment, I considered staying silent, letting the mistake happen, letting the consequences arrive naturally. But that would have been reckless, not strategic. So instead, I did something very simple. At the end of the meeting, just before everyone stood up, I spoke, calmly. "Oliver, I said, pointing gently at the projection slide. "I think the Asia-Pacific Index shifted last week. That assumption might need updating." The room went quiet. Oliver looked back at the screen, then at his notes. His expression changed slowly. Richard leaned forward. "Is that correct?" Oliver hesitated. "Yes, it looks like I may need to revise that." The meeting ended a few minutes later. Nothing dramatic happened, no accusations, no embarrassment. But the seed had been planted. The executives had just seen something subtle. Their new director needed correction from the man they had just passed over. After the meeting, Richard stopped me near the elevators. "Good catch," he said. I nodded. "Just doing my job." And that was the truth, at least technically, because what they didn't understand yet was that I wasn't correcting Oliver to help him. I was doing it for a different reason entirely. I wanted the executives to slowly remember something they had tried very hard to forget: who actually understood their business. That small moment didn't damage Oliver's reputation. Not yet, but it introduced doubt, and doubt spreads quietly inside organizations. Later that evening, as I shut down my office computer, I checked my inbox one last time. There was another message from Andrew Fletcher, short, direct. "Daniel, would you be open to a private call tomorrow? I have some concerns about the direction of our account." I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time since the promotion meeting, I allowed myself a small smile. Because while the executives believed they had finished their move, I had just begun mine. They thought the story ended the day Oliver took that office, but I knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning.
At first, nothing looked different inside Harrington & Cole. The same polished hallways, the same quiet confidence in the executive offices, the same routine meetings that filled the calendar every week. But something subtle had started to shift. And the strange thing about quiet pressure is that most people don't recognize it until it's already too late. A few days after Andrew Fletcher emailed me asking for a private call, we scheduled a short conversation. Nothing official, just 15 minutes. That was the agreement. But conversations with people who trust you rarely stay that short. Andrew's voice sounded polite when the call began, professional, but there was a hesitation underneath it. "Daniel," he said, "I wanted to ask you something off the record." I leaned back in my chair and kept my tone neutral. "Of course." There was a short pause on the line. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. "Is something changing inside Harrington & Cole?" I didn't answer immediately. Silence can say more than explanations. Finally, I responded carefully. "The company is going through some leadership adjustments." Another pause. Andrew exhaled quietly. "That's what I thought." Then he said something that confirmed everything I had suspected. "We've worked with you for almost 8 years, Daniel. You understand our strategy better than anyone, but suddenly we're dealing with someone new who seems unfamiliar with the details." His words were calm, but calm concerns from major clients are far more dangerous than loud complaints, because calm clients don't argue, they leave. I didn't criticize Oliver Grant. I didn't reveal what had happened in that conference room. Instead, I said something simple. "If you ever need clarification about previous strategies, I'm still available to help." Andrew thanked me. The call ended, but the consequences of that quiet conversation began spreading in ways the executives couldn't see yet. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere inside the company started changing. Small things at first: clients asking more questions during meetings, emails requesting additional documentation, follow-up calls that normally wouldn't be necessary. Nothing dramatic, nothing openly hostile, just uncertainty. And uncertainty creates pressure. I began noticing it in Oliver's behavior. During meetings, his confidence was still there, but it looked slightly forced now. He spoke faster, checked his notes more often. Sometimes he glanced in my direction when clients asked detailed questions. The executives started noticing it too.
One afternoon, I passed Richard Collins in the hallway. He stopped me. "Daniel," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "have any clients contacted you directly recently?" The question was careful, almost casual, but I could hear the concern behind it. I answered honestly. "A few have asked for clarification on older projects." Richard studied my face for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Just keep directing them to Oliver." "Of course," I replied, and I meant it. I wasn't trying to steal accounts. I wasn't sabotaging meetings. I was simply existing, and that was enough. Because the real damage wasn't coming from anything I was doing. It was coming from something the executives had underestimated. Trust. Trust doesn't transfer automatically when someone new takes control. It takes years to build, years Oliver didn't have. The tension became more visible during one quarterly review meeting. Martin Harrington sat at the head of the table. Oliver presented the latest client updates. Most of the numbers looked stable, but one line on the report stood out. Fletcher Global Holdings, contract status, under review. Martin looked up from the document. Under review? Oliver shifted slightly in his chair. They've requested some additional strategy clarification. Martin's expression hardened. After 8 years of stable partnership? Oliver nodded. Yes, it's likely just routine adjustments. But the room felt different after that. Executives exchanged quiet looks, the kind people try to hide. Later that afternoon, Oliver approached my desk. He rarely did that before. "Daniel," he said carefully, "have you spoken with Andrew Fletcher recently?" I looked up from my screen. "Yes." His eyes narrowed slightly. "About their contract?" "No," I said calmly, "just some historical strategy questions." Oliver didn't respond immediately. He studied me for a moment, as if trying to decide whether I was a problem or a solution. Then he forced a polite smile. "Right, thanks." He walked away quickly. That was the first moment I saw something new in his posture. Not confidence, concern. Because deep down, Oliver knew something the executives hadn't realized yet. The clients weren't reacting to him. They were reacting to the absence of me. And absences create questions. Questions create fear. Inside organizations, fear spreads quietly. Emails become shorter. Meetings become longer. Executives start asking for updates they never needed before. I watched all of it carefully, patiently, because revenge, real revenge, doesn't come from anger. It comes from understanding exactly where the pressure points are. But there was another reason I stayed calm, something none of them knew, something I had discovered weeks earlier while reviewing old client documents late one evening. Hidden inside the company's internal records was access to something extremely valuable, something catastrophic if it ever became public. Strategic acquisition documents, confidential negotiation records, evidence of decisions that could destroy reputations if they were examined closely enough. I had access to all of it, not because I hacked anything, because I had built half the deals myself. And suddenly, I found myself wondering something I hadn't considered before. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? Because as the pressure inside Harrington and Cole slowly increased, the executives still believed the situation was manageable. They thought the client concerns were temporary. They thought Oliver just needed time. But sitting alone in my office one evening, scrolling through the confidential files glowing on my screen, I realized something that changed the entire situation. If things continued the way they were going, I wouldn't just have the power to leave the company, I would have the power to destroy it.
By the time the pressure inside Harrington and Cole became visible, it was already far too late to stop it. At first, the signs were subtle. A delayed client response here, an unusually tense meeting there. But inside corporate structures, damage rarely appears all at once. It spreads quietly through conversations, through hesitation, through the small shift in tone people use when they stop feeling certain. I started noticing it during executive meetings. For years, those meetings had followed a predictable rhythm. confident presentations, short discussions, decisions made quickly. But now the tone had changed. Questions lasted longer. Executives asked for additional reports. Numbers were double-checked. And one name kept appearing in almost every conversation: Fletcher Global Holdings. Their contract had once been considered one of the most stable accounts in the entire firm. 8 years, multiple successful deals, millions in revenue. But now the phrase "under review" kept appearing beside their name in internal reports, and that single phrase made people nervous. One afternoon, the tension finally surfaced publicly. We were sitting in the main conference room again, the same room where Oliver Grant had been congratulated weeks earlier. This time, the atmosphere was very different. The CEO, Martin Harrington, looked tired. His usual calm authority had faded slightly. Oliver stood near the screen, presenting a contract update. His voice was steady, but the confidence underneath it sounded fragile. "Fletcher Global has requested a temporary pause while they reassess their strategy," he explained. Martin leaned forward slowly. "A pause?" he repeated. "Yes," Oliver said carefully. "They want additional clarification before moving forward." The room fell quiet. Everyone understood what that really meant. Clients don't pause multi-million-dollar contracts without serious doubts. Martin turned toward the rest of the executives. "Has Daniel been involved in any of these conversations?" Every head in the room turned toward me. I sat calmly at the end of the table. "Only historical clarifications," I replied. That was the truth, at least technically. Martin studied my expression carefully. For a moment, I wondered if he could see the truth behind my calm voice, but he eventually nodded and returned his attention to Oliver. The meeting ended soon after. No one celebrated anything that day. As people left the room, I could hear quiet conversations beginning in the hallway. Low voices, concerned questions. The executives were no longer relaxed. The pressure had become visible. But the most interesting moment came later that evening. I was preparing to leave the office when someone knocked on the glass wall of my workspace. It was Oliver Grant. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His posture was tense. "Daniel," he said quietly, closing the door behind him, "we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "About what?" He hesitated. Then he spoke more directly. "About Fletcher Global." His eyes stayed fixed on me. "You've been speaking with them." It wasn't a question, it was an accusation, but his voice lacked certainty. "I've answered questions when they asked," I replied calmly. "That's not the same thing." Oliver walked closer to the desk. "You know they trust you more than they trust me." For a moment, the room was silent. Then I said something simple. "That wasn't my decision." His jaw tightened slightly. "You could help stabilize the situation." I studied him carefully. It was the first time since his promotion that Oliver looked genuinely nervous. Not defensive, not arrogant, nervous. "You're the director of strategic accounts now," I said quietly. "That's your responsibility." He exhaled slowly. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I shook my head. "No." And strangely enough, that answer was honest. Enjoyment had nothing to do with it. This wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural. A series of consequences unfolding exactly the way systems often do when people underestimate the wrong person. Oliver stood there for a moment longer. Then he said something that revealed far more than he probably intended. "You should have left the company weeks ago." The words hung in the air between us. That sentence confirmed something important. My presence wasn't just uncomfortable for him, it was dangerous, because the executives had assumed I would react the way most people do after being passed over: resign, disappear, start somewhere else. Instead, I stayed, and staying changed everything. After Oliver left, I sat quietly in my office watching the city lights through the glass windows. Then I opened the same confidential files I had discovered weeks earlier. Acquisition negotiations, internal financial projections, private executive discussions,
documents that had never been meant to leave the company's internal system. I scrolled through them slowly, not searching for revenge, searching for confirmation, and eventually I found it. An internal strategy document from nearly 6 months earlier. The subject line was short, Leadership Transition Plan. Inside the document were several bullet points outlining the gradual reassignment of my clients to Oliver. But one line stood out more than anything else. Maintain Daniel Carter's operational involvement until the transition is complete. Operational involvement. In other words, keep using my relationships until they no longer needed them, then remove me quietly. I leaned back in my chair and closed the file. The strange thing was that none of this surprised me anymore. By then, the pattern was obvious. The executives had set their plan in motion long before that promotion meeting. They believed they controlled the outcome, but what they didn't understand was something far dangerous. The moment they started that transition plan, I had already become the most unpredictable variable inside their system, because what they thought was a simple personnel decision had triggered something entirely else, a chain reaction. And the most important part was this: by the time they realized the consequences were real, the damage had already begun.
By the time the executives at Harrington and Cole realized something was seriously wrong, the atmosphere inside the company had changed completely. The calm confidence that once filled the hallways had disappeared. People spoke more quietly now. Meetings lasted longer. Emails that used to take minutes to answer now took hours, sometimes days. And one account kept appearing in every conversation: Fletcher Global Holdings. For years, Fletcher Global had been one of the most reliable partnerships in the firm. Their contracts alone represented a massive portion of the company's strategic revenue. Losing them wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be catastrophic. And slowly, that possibility was becoming real. I could feel the tension every morning when I walked into the building. Assistants whispering near reception, managers checking financial reports repeatedly, executives moving between offices with expressions that looked more like worry than authority. But the most telling sign came one Monday morning. An emergency executive meeting had been scheduled. Everyone knew what it was about before we even sat down. The moment the meeting began, Martin Harrington placed a printed report on the table. "This came in late Friday," he said. No one spoke. Oliver Grant sat stiffly beside the projection screen. Martin continued. "Fletcher Global has officially suspended negotiations on their renewal contract." The words hung in the air like something heavy and dangerous. A suspended negotiation didn't mean the deal was gone yet, but it meant the trust behind it was cracking. Martin turned slowly toward Oliver. "What happened?" Oliver swallowed before answering. "They've requested time to reassess their strategic partnerships." Martin's voice grew sharper. "After 8 years?" Oliver hesitated. "I believe they're concerned about continuity in account management." No one needed clarification on what that meant. Continuity. The absence of me. The room felt colder after that. Executives exchanged looks, quiet calculations happening behind their eyes. Because everyone understood the same thing. If Fletcher Global walked away, others might follow. And companies like Harrington and Cole are built on perception. Once confidence cracks, it spreads. After the meeting ended, the pressure inside the building became almost unbearable. People moved faster. Phones rang constantly. Internal emails carried an urgency I had never seen before. Meanwhile, I remained exactly the same. Calm, professional, present. That calmness seemed to disturb people more than anything else. Later that afternoon, Richard Collins asked me to step into his office. The door closed behind us. Richard looked exhausted. His usual polished confidence had faded.
"Daniel," he began carefully, "we need to stabilize the Fletcher account." I waited. He continued, "They trust you, that's obvious." There it was, the truth finally spoken aloud. He leaned forward slightly. "If you spoke with them, helped reassure them, we might still salvage the situation." For a moment I said nothing, because I understood exactly what he was asking. Not officially, but clearly. He wanted me to fix the damage they had created, to repair the trust they had already broken. "You want me to step back into the account," I said quietly. Richard hesitated. "Temporarily." The words sounded almost fragile. Temporary solutions for permanent mistakes. I studied his face. The same man who had promised me promotion after promotion. The same man who had stood silently while Oliver replaced me. "You made Oliver the director. He should lead the account." Richard's expression tightened. "This isn't about titles anymore." Exactly. That was the problem. For years they believed titles were everything. But trust doesn't follow titles. Trust follows people. And now they were learning that lesson too late. I stood up slowly. "If there's nothing else," I said quietly, "I should return to work." Richard didn't stop me. He knew. Deep down, he understood something irreversible had already happened. That evening, I sat alone in my office long after most employees had gone home. The city lights reflected against the glass walls. My computer screen glowed quietly in the dark room. On the screen were the same confidential files I had discovered weeks earlier. Internal acquisition plans, executive communications, documents that revealed exactly how the company operated behind closed doors. I stared at them for a long time, not because I wanted to destroy the company, but because I was beginning to understand the cost of what I had started. Revenge sounds simple when people imagine it. They think it's about anger, about dramatic confrontations. But real revenge is different. It requires patience, silence, and sometimes it requires becoming someone you never expected to be. For the first time since this began, I asked myself a difficult question. What happens if this goes too far? If Fletcher Global leaves, if the company's reputation collapses, if careers are destroyed, including my own? Because no matter how careful I had been, I was still standing in the center of the storm. And storms rarely leave the person who started them untouched. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the dark ceiling above me, and another question formed slowly in my mind, one that felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? That night, as I shut down my computer and prepared to leave the building, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A message notification. It was from Andrew Fletcher. Short, direct, but the meaning behind it changed everything. "Daniel, I think you should know something. Our board has decided who we want to continue working with." I stared at the message for several seconds. Then another message appeared immediately after. "Your executives don't know it yet, but we've already made our decision." And in that moment, standing alone in the quiet office hallway, I realized something that made my chest tighten slightly. The executives at Harrington & Cole still believed the situation was uncertain. They still believed the damage might be reversible. But someone else had finally understood the truth. The person destroying them was me. The final collapse of Harrington & Cole didn't happen with shouting. There were no dramatic confrontations, no doors slammed, no accusations thrown across conference tables. Real endings rarely look like that. They arrive quietly, almost politely. It happened 3 weeks after Andrew Fletcher's message. By then, the tension inside the company had become impossible to ignore. Executives held closed-door meetings nearly every day. Financial analysts moved through the offices carrying printed reports that looked more like warning signs than projections. Conversations stopped when certain people entered the room. Everyone could feel something approaching, but no one knew exactly when it would arrive. That morning began like any other. I walked into the building just before 9. The receptionist gave the same polite greeting she always had. Elevators opened and closed with the same quiet, mechanical rhythm. But when I reached the 18th floor, I noticed something different. The executive conference room doors were already closed. Inside, the entire leadership team had gathered. Half an hour later, an internal message appeared in everyone's inbox. Emergency executive briefing. All senior staff required. By 10 o'clock, we were all seated around the same long conference table. The same room where Oliver Grant had been celebrated. The same room where my career inside the company had quietly ended. Now the atmosphere felt completely different. Martin Harrington stood at the head of the table, holding a printed document. His expression was calm, but the tension in his posture was impossible to hide. "We received official notice this morning," he began. No one spoke. Martin continued slowly. "Fletcher Global Holdings has terminated their strategic partnership with Harrington & Cole." The words settled heavily across the room. Millions in annual revenue gone. But that wasn't the worst part. Martin placed another document on the table. "They've also announced a new consulting partnership." He paused briefly. Then he said the words everyone in the room would remember for years. "Carter and Walker Consulting."
Silence followed. Real silence, the kind that feels almost physical. Several executives turned their heads slowly toward me. Some looked confused, some looked angry, but the expression on Richard Collins' face was something else entirely. Understanding. Because in that moment he finally realized what had been happening all along. I hadn't sabotaged the company. I hadn't attacked anyone. I had simply done something far more dangerous. I had walked away. And when I walked away, the clients followed. Martin looked at me carefully. "You've started your own firm," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied calmly. "How long?" "Long enough." Oliver Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "This is a conflict of interest," he said quickly. I met his eyes. "Not after my resignation." Another document slid across the table. My resignation letter, submitted 2 weeks earlier. Perfectly legal, perfectly timed. The executive studied the timeline silently. Client concerns, contract suspensions, my resignation, the announcement of Carter and Walker Consulting. Every piece of the puzzle finally connecting. Martin leaned back slowly. "You planned this." I shook my head. No. That answer surprised them, but it was still the truth. "I planned my future," I said quietly. "What happened to the company was your decision." No one responded, because deep down they understood exactly what I meant. They had spent months transferring my accounts, preparing my replacement, assuming loyalty meant dependency. But loyalty does not survive betrayal, and trust doesn't transfer on command. Over the next several weeks, the consequences unfolded exactly the way large corporate collapses often do. Other clients began reassessing their partnerships. Internal investigations started reviewing leadership decisions. Financial reports leaked quietly through industry networks. The reputation of Harrington & Cole, once considered untouchable, began to fracture. Meanwhile, Carter and Walker Consulting grew steadily. Not explosively, not dramatically, just steadily. Client by client, deal by deal. The same way trust had always been built. One evening, several months later, I received an unexpected message. It was from Richard Collins.
We met at a quiet restaurant across the city. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. After a few minutes of small talk, he finally asked the question he had been carrying since that meeting. "Daniel," he said quietly, "was this revenge?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered honestly, "No." He looked confused, so I explained. "Revenge is emotional, loud, destructive." I paused. What I did was something else. Richard leaned forward slightly. What was it? I looked out the window at the city lights. It was a lesson. He didn't argue, because by then the lesson was already clear. For 11 years I had given that company everything: my time, my loyalty, my reputation. They believed those things belonged to them, but they never did. When the dinner ended, Richard stood up slowly. Before leaving, he said something that stayed with me long afterward. "We underestimated you." I watched him walk away through the quiet street outside the restaurant, and for the first time since that promotion meeting months earlier, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. Because in the end, I hadn't taken anything from them. They had simply discovered what happens when you betray the person who built the trust holding everything together. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't destruction, it's absence. And the loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.